Good morning to our viewers in the United States. Good afternoon to our viewers in Europe, and good evening, very late evening to our viewers in Asia. I'm David Goldman, Asia Times Deputy Editor, and I am honored to host another webinar with the distinguished semiconductor industry expert, Dr. Handel Jones. Dr. Jones is CEO of International Business Strategies and a consultant to really almost every important player in the semiconductor industry, and speaking as a journalist, the ultimate source on these matters. The theme of today's discussion is Tech Wars, the Empire Strikes Back. After our initial discussion, where Dr. Jones will comment, and I'll ask him questions, we'll open up to questions from you, our viewers. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. So please write out your questions. Typically, many of them are similar, so I'll try to fold them into questions to allow Dr. Jones to comment on the widest possible spectrum, reflecting your interests. Now, Dr. Jones, we've called this seminar Tech Wars, the Empire Strikes Back. I'd like to mention a comment by Graham Allison, a professor at Harvard. He's the author of a very widely commented book called The Thucydides Trap, warning about the prospect of war between the United States and China. Last year, he discussed the Trump administration's sanctions against Huawei, ZTE, and many other Chinese companies, limiting their acquisition to high-end American computer chips, as well as chip-making equipment and chip design equipment containing American intellectual property. Dr. Allison said, this is comparable to the American boycott of oil against Japan in August of 1941, which of course was the trigger for Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor and the beginning of the Sino-American War in the Pacific. So in the view of some distinguished people, we do have a tech war on. And what I'd like to ask you first is, although we in the United States don't think of this as a war, how does China see this?
Thank you. It is really a war, but not in the sense of the Japan oil boycott, because Japan did not have any oil resources. If you look at the numbers, in 2020, China exported about $239 billion worth of semiconductors. And that was about over 50% of the global market for semiconductors. So that includes, of course, the semiconductors consumed in China, but also included in smartphones like the iPhones that are assembled in China. Some of it, not all, sometimes some are assembled in Vietnam and so on, but then exported. In 2030, we're showing that China will import around $640 billion. And that basically will be, again, over 50% of the global market. So even though Huawei is not getting access to semiconductors, at least through normal channels, ZTE is. ZTE paid a fine, and they're actually buying semiconductors. So yeah, there's been some limitations for some companies, but other companies are booming in China. And if we look at the sales of TSMC, for example, they sold about 6% of their revenue into China in Q1 of 2021. In Q2, it was 11%. And if you look at the growth of TSMC from Q1 to Q2, they effectively doubled their sales of wafers into China. So the China semiconductor market is booming, and it's booming because of the restrictions being placed on them by the US. And it's a national issue right now. They have to have a strong industry in semiconductors because that's the foundation for electronics. That's the foundation for many of the growth areas going forward. As you saw, they just announced their 600-kilometer-per-hour train. That train consumes quite a bit of semiconductors. And of course, they're high power, high voltage, and so on. But it's critical for them to get access to semiconductors. And so what they're doing is they're building up their own capabilities to design. But manufacturing, though, they still need outside sources. And with TSMC being critical, followed by Samsung.
Has China announced an all-country effort to reduce its dependency on foreign semiconductors? Xi Jinping put Liu He, the economic czar, in charge of this. From some news reports we've seen recently, China's semiconductor production is up by 40% year on year. What's your evaluation of China's effort to establish itself as a major manufacturer of semiconductors?
Well, there are two parts to that answer. One, from a design point of view, where they design the chips and have them manufactured outside. And in 2020, for the non-memory ICs, they basically supplied about 20% of their own chips. 80% came from outside. In 2030, we have them producing more than 50% of their own chips in that arena. Now, for memory, basically in 2030, they only produce about 10%. The rest come from Samsung. Samsung has a fab in Xi'an. SK Hynix, they have a fab in Wuxi, Micron. So memory, we don't think they will have good success. In terms of the wafer processing, SMIC is at 14, 12, but there are restrictions to getting equipment below 12. So they will still need access to TSMC and access to Samsung. But also recently, TSMC announced they're going to increase capacity in Nanjing for 28 nanometer technology. And of course, that's to support the China market, but also to try and slow down the building of capacity by Chinese foundry vendors in China for above 12.
Dr. Jones, since we're dealing with a lot of numbers here, I know that you prepared some slides. It might be helpful for our viewers for you to show them now and set a baseline in terms of what the picture is.
Thank you. Okay, so in terms of slide 2,
I think you need to share the screen.
Could we get the host to disable preventing us from screen sharing?
Are we? Does Dr. Jones have permission for screen sharing? Well, we'll get that in a, while we're doing that, Dr. Jones. How are China's trading partners looking at this? As you mentioned, TSMC is building capacity in China. Samsung is building capacity in China. Certainly, China has been an enormous customer of all of the semiconductor equipment manufacturers. How does Japan, South Korea, Taiwan see China's industry? Are they integrated into this? Are they concerned about it? Are they trying to help it?
It's a very mixed, relationship. If you look at the political leaders in Japan, they talk about a crisis in terms of the relationship with China. If you talk to the automobile companies in Japan, they're getting record sales in China and now pushing aggressively in terms of electric vehicles. Germany, they have a positive trade balance with China, one of the few countries who have that positive trade balance. So they again are trying to increase collaboration, revenues from China. France is in a similar position. Again, being careful of not violating what's viewed as US sanctions and so on. But again, in many cases, the European countries, at least the ones we are in discussions with, they don't understand the US policies because they don't see the long-term value. South Korea, of course, is in a very difficult position, but Samsung is expanding capacity in Xi'an. And of course, SK Hynix basically are buying the Intel NAND business, which has a fab in Dalian. So these countries regard China as a very large market, growth in opportunities in the China market, and in many ways increased collaboration, like electric vehicles is one. There's increased collaboration in terms of batteries, in terms of the technology for electric vehicles, etc. So I think we can do the screen sharing now.
Yes, please go ahead.
So in terms of the top level perspective, what we see in China right now is what we view as significant increase in confidence in the high technology industry. So this is a big shift over the past 12 months. And a key part of it, of course, is their success in not only designing semiconductor products, but then the equipment or the end products that use the semiconductors. So if you look at the 5G smartphone market, which is a highly competitive market, Chinese vendors have more than 50% of the global market. That's Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo. The ones that they haven't fully beaten yet, both in technology, but maybe in volume, are Samsung and Apple. But there's been a huge increase in terms of confidence in that space. They also, the inputs that I get, and we've had discussions extensively over the past few weeks, why do they have this confidence with the US against the US? And of course, there's a huge amount of publicity going on regarding the lack of the inability of the US to control COVID. But of course, with the vaccines of Pfizer and Moderna are significantly better than the vaccines of China. But in terms of the activities of the US government in high technology, that's being looked at very carefully. But yeah, they're going to allocate some funding, but there's no clear path in terms of how that funding will be used and who will benefit and what the long-term capabilities are. And then the Xi Jinping speech during the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party was a very positive message for them. Again, China is not going to be bullied. China is competitive in a global market. You attack us and we'll attack you back. So that's a dramatic change in attitude and confidence over the past 12 months. Now, as I mentioned, to you, David, I also brought up the Qin dynasty to some of my friends in China, and they smile because they've had this kind of growth in the past and it hasn't been sustained. But the Belt and Road Initiative is an attempt not to become overly concerned with inside China. And of course, when we look at the exports to the US, that basically is on slide 4. We're going to have, if we continue with the annual run rate, we would buy about 365 billion from China this year. I think in 2008 it was 377 or 378. This year probably is going to be higher. So here we are basically beating up on China, and I think there are some reasons, valid reasons for that. But again, we're highly, highly dependent on them. So they actually, if they put some strong measures against us, they actually have significant power. So
let's talk about that for a second. The empire strikes back. What are China's options to respond to what they view as American attempts to stop them from rising?
Well, the acceleration or the funding for the acceleration of technologies within many industries. So as I mentioned earlier, semiconductors are the foundations for many of the areas of growth. So a key area for them is artificial intelligence. And that's going to be used in many, many areas. Smartphones, of course, have it for picture taking, but right now for 3D facial recognition, for processing big data, for medical industry and so on. So they're stimulating both the semiconductor industry itself, but also demand for semiconductors. So if you look at robots are used in factories today, volumes are quite low. So if you develop semiconductors for robots, the market is quite small. But if you develop a robot industry, for care of the aged, for all sorts of other things, for shops and so on, then the market for robots becomes big. And then the market for semiconductor for robots becomes big. So that's the strategy in China. You build the market, you build the supply chains. And of course, as I mentioned, not all areas are successful, but there's incredible momentum right now. And the Star Exchange in Shanghai is very powerful because it's encouraged entrepreneurs to start companies. We're hearing that 2,000, 3,000 semiconductor companies are being started a year. We've heard high numbers, maybe 100 will survive. But that encourages investments in semiconductors. And then, of course, when you cash out, you make money and you invest some more. So they're doing these things to encourage entrepreneurs, while, of course, having very tight control over many other areas. So it's right now a highly managed top-down economy, but with a very thriving entrepreneurial environment also.
I'm trying to understand what American policy is. Of course, the chip sanctions and IP sanctions against China came from the Trump administration. The Biden administration came in and basically left everything in place. It's hard to know what they're thinking. The senior policy development person for China at the White House is the senior director for China and National Security Council, Rush Doshi, who used to run China research at the Brookings Institution. Extremely bright guy. Just published a book, and I read it closely and found that the term semiconductor doesn't appear anywhere in the book, let alone computer chip or anything like this. So do you detect any policy development, any policy reconsideration in Washington to respond to this?
Well, there are many activities, and Senator Schumer, I think, is very active in terms of basically trying to get funding for the semiconductor industry. And he was in Malta on Monday of this week with Global Foundries, where they're going to expand capacity. And I think Global Foundries is doing a really good job, but the lowest technology is 12 nanometers. Intel basically are trying to catch up with TSMC, but today Intel's at 10 and TSMC is at 5. This is nanometers. Intel 7 might be Intel 10 might be as good as TSMC 7. So there are attempts now to provide funding for those companies to build capacity. And when you build capacity, then that reduces emphasis or buying from outside of the US. When you look at the wafer supply, there's almost nothing coming from China to the US. It's really coming from Taiwan. If you look at memory, it's coming from Samsung, Micron. Their main facilities are in Japan, Taiwan, and Singapore. So it's a 10-year effort to build the advanced manufacturing capacity in the US. And I think that's good. But again, what are the specific goals? And who's going to get the resources and how are they going to do it? So those details have not been worked out. Maybe they'll be worked out in time, but this is maybe a 10-year activity. But I think in the near term, the biggest concern the US should have is Taiwan. Basically, as long as TSMC and Taiwanese companies can supply the wafers, the US semiconductor industry is okay. But if there's an issue with Taiwan, then it becomes very serious. It also becomes serious for China. So it's a serious for both countries, US, China, but also for Europe. We shouldn't neglect Europe. Europe is a key part of the semiconductor industry also.
Now, I interrupted you. Do you have more slides that you want to put up?
So I think the slide number 6, this shows, as I mentioned earlier, back in 2006, of the semiconductors sold into China, 11.5% were consumed by Chinese companies. This is some of the automobile companies, smartphones weren't around, and so on. In 2020, it's now up to 51%. And in 2070, it's going to be 70%. So these are key metrics of the strengthening of the electronics industry in China. Now, of course, some of these semiconductors, again, assembled by ODMs like Foxconn, but the growth of the smartphone market in China is dramatic. Now, the next big growth area will be electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles. And then, of course, data centers is another area where they're spending big money. So, when we look at 10-year increments, we see these big changes. And again, we shouldn't ignore them because it shows them in terms of quantitative measures of what's going on in China. Let's go to the next slide.
Yes, sorry, go ahead. Do you have another slide?
Yeah. So these are areas of emphasis in China. So when we talk about the US, when we look at smartphones, it's really Apple. But right now, Apple is being investigated or potentially being investigated by Washington for unfair business practices. Now, Xiaomi and Oppo, Vivo, and so on, basically, they're being encouraged now. There are some companies like Alibaba and companies that are very data intensive, where China is basically putting significant controls on them. 5G infrastructure. We have nothing in the US, basically. This is Ericsson, Nokia. AI in the cloud. The US is leadership. This is Google. This is Amazon. And this is Facebook. Again, Washington is saying, well, you're abusing your power. So the AI edge applications, basically, this includes, sensing for temperature, other sensors for health, and so on. Space technologies is an area where China is still behind the US, but closing the gap. Robotics is going to be a huge industry, not just for industrial applications, but care for the aged. The medical industry, the operations, EV batteries, big investment, huge investments. And again, they're going to have solid-state batteries, solid-state lithium batteries, probably in 2025. They're doing fuel cells, also the low-cost batteries. And with autonomous transportation, this is a huge effort by 2035. Smart health, this will probably be the biggest industry in the 2030 to 2040 in the global environment. Smart education, huge effort now on intensive education for mathematics, for Mandarin in terms of memory, physics, to actually breed or condition a significant population of young people who are both highly educated but also highly competitive. And there's a huge failure rate in the education system, but the ones that survive become highly competitive. It's like training Olympic athletes, basically. Then smart agriculture, land is polluted, going to vertical buildings, and then, of course, smart cities. That's a long-term effort. Autonomous transportation will require the separation of people and transportation vehicles. So again, these are areas that we know of where there's emphasis. So if you look at each of these areas, where is the US government placing emphasis?
That we don't, unfortunately, we know the answer to that question, which is not very much at all. In terms of the speed of build out, China now, I believe, has about 90% of the world's 5G smartphones, and about 80% of the world's 5G infrastructure. And they're continuing to build out very rapidly. Have you detected any slowdown or bottlenecks in China's 5G build out as a result of American sanctions?
Yes. In terms of the 5G smartphones, yeah, we have them actually about 60%. If you look at Samsung and Apple, Samsung is like 200 million, Apple is about 200 million, so on. But again, yeah, it's a big growth. Yeah, there is a slowing in the build out of 5G. ZTE can still build the 5G base stations. Huawei still probably has some inventory, but the number of base stations by the end of this year that they projected before was about 1.5 million. Now it probably will be about 1.2 million. So it's lower. So there's less public emphasis on 5G in China, the infrastructure. So I think in terms of ZTE, though, they can only get chips 12 nanometers and above. So this is a very sore point in China right now. And we're basically we're curious as to why they haven't increased some kind of emphasis on this. Huawei sued Verizon for IP patents, and they settled. But Huawei has a very, very strong patent portfolio in 5G, so they could block Ericsson, they could block Nokia. So something is going on that we're missing. I don't know if it's related to Canada, but something is missing in terms of China being very, in our opinion, relatively passive here. There's one more point I want to make, though. When we do look at China, it is government plus industry. And the government plus industry includes the SOEs that in many ways are very inefficient. And you have then the entrepreneurs that are highly efficient. But is government and industry the right pattern? Is that sustainable? US has tended to be, government hands-off in terms of companies in many cases, and that has given us some very good results. I mean, Amazon, basically what they've done in terms of delivering goods is outstanding. If you look at what Google has done in many areas, outstanding. If you look at what Facebook has done, outstanding. If you look at what Apple has done, outstanding. And you can go on, you can list on and on. Cisco and Palantir and many, many companies. And they've had some government contracts, but not significant government investments and so on. But is the China model sustainable? And as wealth is built, will the people in China, the middle class and the upper middle class, will they be satisfied with this control? And as long as the US is viewed as an enemy, as long as the US has high profile as an enemy, I think it can be effective. But as they become more successful, and if the US weakens more, and they don't identify a strong external enemy to stimulate the internal activities, then that could be a significant challenge.
Let's talk for a second about one. If we're done with the slides, perhaps we should return to
I think so.
Screen.
Yeah.
Thank you. Last week, virtually all the major institutions of the West joined together to denounce China for allowing or sponsoring hacking of Western networks, particularly in reference to the Microsoft Exchange server hack. It was an extraordinary show of unanimity on the part of the West. How serious is the cyber war issue between the United States and China?
Well, in my opinion, it is very serious. And it's the beginning of the development of the data war. So it's really in future, the big competition is going to be in the data arena. Even though big money is being spent in military, it's the data arena with artificial intelligence that's going to be the big war. Israel, by the way, has fully recognized this. And what Israel is doing in terms of AI, et cetera, is outstanding. I mean, if the US just did what Israel is doing and had the same focus as Israel, I think it'd be really good for the US. However, what you need is high level of security. You need very high levels of encryption capabilities. Quantum communications is already being used in China. Quantum computing obviously will be important, but it's a huge issue. Now, China is denying that the hacking came from them. Who knows? But again, we have to look at this as probably the most serious threat going forward from China, from Russia, from a number of other countries, because hacking into the US ecosystem is actually not that difficult. So yeah, it's a huge threat. And again, this is the basis for artificial intelligence. This is the basis for enhancing semiconductor capabilities. This is the basis for going to smaller feature dimensions. This is the basis for new architectures. So again, Google is still the global leader, and Amazon is outstanding, and Facebook and so on, Microsoft, we have leadership here, but it's within companies. So what we see in China is the combination of this in companies, and of course they're worried, Chinese government is worried about the excessive power, but then there are huge government investments. When we looked in the past, probably we're talking about a few $billions a year in terms of funding support for artificial intelligence.
Let me go back for a second to something you said about data as a resource. I've heard people say that if oil was the fuel of the second industrial revolution, then data is the fuel of the fourth industrial revolution. AI processing is the engine, but data is the fuel. China has a vast amount of data, particularly in the medical field, which Western researchers are trying to get access to. To what extent is data a resource that China can control and choke off access to the West? To what extent can China retaliate by making its data less accessible to Western companies?
Today, I think data seems to be concentrated within different countries. Data is not something which is that transportable in the way you transport goods and when you monetize it. So the search engines in China, like Baidu, are controlled within China. They don't use the Google search engine and so on. So you have data within the country, but then of course you also have the data in terms of the military, and then the global communications infrastructure. So we have servers, for our companies in different parts of the world. So you need to basically transmit that data. Now, a lot of it is transmitted by fiber, so that tends to be not that tamper-proof, but we're going more to the mobile data. 5G, 6G is going to come in. So there's a data inside the country that gives you a high level of efficiency within the country, and then you can use the data in terms of cyber warfare. And the cyber warfare is the big threat. And the problem is you really can't detect where it comes from, or it's going to become more difficult to detect where it comes from. So so maybe if it comes from a server in China, well, you put the server in Kazakhstan, you put the server in somewhere else, and then you don't really know where it came from. So the generation of data, probably today in the US, probably 1% of the data that's generated is processed, and probably the amount of data that's processed, maybe another 1% is usable. But that's going to change over time. And the monetization of data is the essence of where we're going in the future. Autonomous transportation in China will be heavily data-oriented. 3D facial recognition is heavily data-oriented. So data, how you generate data, how you process the data, how you store the data, and then how you use it, both from the defensive perspective and offensive perspective, will be key.
I'd like to take a question from one of our listeners now, if I may. Listener asks, the Internet of Things is going to connect an enormous part of economic life to the Internet. Doesn't that mean that hacks could have much more disruptive effect on economic life than in the past?
Exactly right, yes. And that is, so we have the edge activities, and today you have a doorbell which is connected to your Wi-Fi and so on. It's actually highly susceptible. If you look at the automobiles, they could have, some of the high-end automobiles have hundreds of microcontrollers, highly susceptible to hacking. And again, as we put more of our daily lives data onto the internet, and we're going to be doing that, medical records, all sorts of records, it becomes increasingly prone to hacking. And when you do hack, what do you want to do? You can actually try and get money, which is a simplistic form, but you can also cripple part of the economy. The pipeline that got shut down, that crippled some of the oil, but that's just the beginning. I mean, the airlines can be hacked. Basically, flights can I don't want to go be that negative that flights, planes will crash and so on, but you can basically block them from flying, and you can divert them to multiple airports. So it's a big part of our future life. How you protect the data, how you manage it. This is the essence of success in the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Another listener asks how important the Belt and Road Initiative is in actually two or three questions, which I'll try to summarize together. China is doing a lot of low-tech investment in terms of ports, railroads, and so forth. In the Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of high-tech investments at home. Is there a Chinese high-tech strategy for expanding its influence outside China in context of the Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, the Belt and Road Initiative is having mixed success, but it does show the fact that China is looking outside of China. And of course, a big part of it is to try and ensure supply chains for oil, gas, and resources. And of course, another part is the transportation of goods into Europe. So it's a very mixed success to date. They are using the Belt and Road initiatives to install and test nuclear power stations. But yeah, I think longer term, there will be some high-tech issues, but many of the countries involved in the Belt and Road initiatives are very low-tech. So there will be an attempt to, there was an attempt or a planned attempt to really proliferate 5G in those countries. But again, what the US has done, limiting access to semiconductors for 5G, has slowed 5G in China, but also slowed 5G outside of China. So is that of benefit to the US? Yeah, I think there could be some benefits. The bigger beneficiaries could be Ericsson and Nokia, but strategically, yeah, you slow down 5G in other countries. Is that a good thing for the US? You know, maybe some benefits, but some also negatives.
Apropos of that last comment, there's a question from a listener regarding China's decision to limit Ericsson's participation in their 5G build-out. If China is short on resources to accomplish its 5G build-out, why would it keep Ericsson out?
Well, the Swedish government, of course, blocked 5G in Sweden, and the head of Ericsson begged them not to do that.
You mean block Huawei in Sweden?
Yes, sorry, blocked Huawei in Sweden. Sorry, yeah. Begged Swedish government not to do that, but they went ahead and did it. So Nokia is now getting some business in China, but we don't think it's going to be significant business because even though ZTE is behind Huawei in terms of 5G, ZTE is significantly ahead of Nokia. So it's kind of a token offering. But we think by the end of the year, China will do something significant to try and release chips for 5G infrastructure. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the options is the patent issue. But I think they will also come up with some other, something which is stronger than that to try and get the Biden administration to relent. You know, ZTE got the ability to ship products into China, and ZTE performance last year was quite good by paying 1.2 billion fine. If Huawei paid a 10 billion fine, would that resolve the issue? The Huawei smartphone business has basically declined precipitously, but other Chinese companies have filled the void. In 5G, that's difficult. So again, we think, I think it's an interesting question. Why not allow Ericsson to come in? Will the US allow Ericsson to actually have advanced chips in the China market? That issue has not been resolved fully.
Yes.
But again, it is a tit for tat, and I think that's an indication of China striking back. So this is the beginning.
Another listener asks about your estimate on how quickly PRC semiconductor manufacturing equipment suppliers can make breakthroughs on key bottleneck areas such as extreme ultraviolet lithography. I think you'll have to explain to most of our listeners what EUV lithography is to answer the question.
Sure. So when you produce chips at 5 nanometers, you need the very low wavelength that you can get with EUV versus the normal lithography. So US has blocked ASML from shipping that equipment into China. The equipment is extremely complex. I mean, extremely complex. China doesn't stand a chance of producing that equipment in the next 10 years. The problem is that if they do produce it, they have no market, because in addition to that lithography equipment, you also need other equipment. And so they're trying to develop equipment. AMEC is trying to develop equipment for 28, but it doesn't count. So if AMEC does equipment for 5 nanometers or 7 nanometers, there's no market. SMIC will not buy many pieces of equipment because they don't have the other equipment. TSMC will not buy equipment. Samsung will not buy equipment. Intel will not buy equipment. So that position of the US is very strong. And that's why we also say that in the DRAM market, even though CXMT is getting a lot of money, they will not be able to be competitive with Samsung or Micron in the next 10 years. And the same thing with YMTC in the NAND business. And of course, Tsinghua Uni Group, which has funded a big part of YMTC, is insolvent.
Yes.
Yeah.
Another listener asks about 5G build out in the United States. You mentioned in passing before that the United States hasn't gotten very far with 5G. Why is that, and what will it take for the United States to begin to catch up with China's 5G build out?
Well, I think because of a number of things, the US is now accelerating 5G. So basically, T-Mobile is standalone, and now they're investing heavily in 5G. Verizon got a new CEO, and basically he comes from Ericsson. He understands 5G. They paid, I think, 30 or 40 billion for spectrum. And of course, now they have to move quite fast, and they are. AT&T is spinning off its content business and is also focusing on 5G. So through a series of steps, and I think T-Mobile probably was the initiator, US is now moving quite fast in 5G. And I think the progress is quite good. I mean, I think I'm impressed with how things have changed in the last 12, 24 months.
I'd like to interpolate a question of my own. Some weeks ago, I interviewed the chief technology officer of Huawei, who mentioned that Huawei had already installed several thousand private 5G networks for factory automation, port automation, warehouse development, and so forth, productivity applications, and that they expect to have perhaps 10 times that number by the end of next year. So China is moving very rapidly to try to use 5G for the productivity applications that you listed before on one of your slides. I haven't been able to get any numbers for the United States, but they seem to be somewhere in the mid-hundreds as opposed to the thousands. How far ahead is China in terms of harvesting the productivity potential of 5G with respect to the US or Europe?
Well, based on our knowledge of supply chains of semiconductors, I'm very surprised with what he's saying, because that is inconsistent with what we know in terms of supply chain. I mean, the fact they've installed a few thousand, that doesn't surprise me. But the fact they can do 10 times that in the next, intermediate time frame very much surprises me. In many of the factories or the local area of 5G, millimeter wave is a technology that's being widely promoted. And US right now is actually ahead of China in millimeter wave. Qualcomm in terms of chips, even Apple 5G smartphones are millimeter wave. There are some activities in the US, some activities in Europe, but probably at the very, very early stages, it will become a big capability in the future. But right now, because of limitations in semiconductors, I would very much doubt that China is significantly ahead of the US. So if you look at manufacturing in China, the leader in terms of electronics manufacturing is Honhai Foxconn, which is actually a Taiwanese company. And so they're doing some of it, but it's not that extensive to date. So China did, I think, put that kind of capability in the Shanghai station. So they have some of the technologies, but in millimeter wave, US is ahead. So I'm surprised. Again, we don't know everything, but I'm surprised by the projections, the historical information. That's very consistent with what we know. But unless they can get semiconductors, millimeter wave technology is very tough. So again, I'm surprised by the projections, but I think if it happens, I think it'll stimulate the US and also companies that are outside of China to accelerate. BMW, by the way, is also trying to do some of that in terms of automotive manufacturing.
Another question asks about cybersecurity. How important is quantum telecommunications in cybersecurity? You mentioned this in passing, and I think a listener would like you to elaborate.
Well, in China, it's being used right now for government and for military, and it's at the early stages of development. It's going to be quite important. What China is also doing right now is they're developing 6G. So in 3G, they were behind. 4G, they were behind, but 4G, they closed the gap, and 5G, they went ahead, sorry. Now they're developing 6G, and 6G is planned to be adopted around 2029, maybe 2030. And the key emphasis of China in 6G is full control of supply chain. Everything will be produced either by China or allies of China. And that's going to have very extensive quantum communication encryption capabilities. So it's going to become extremely important. And again, significant emphasis in China, much lower level of emphasis in the US. In fact, I don't know anybody in the US that's making significant investments in quantum computing. In China, for 6G, we know sources that have been given multi-billion-dollar funding to develop 6G, multi-billion-dollar funding for 6G.
Could you explain for listeners a bit more what the difference would be between 5G and 6G?
So 5G gives you peak download of 1 gigabit per second to maybe 10 gigabit per second. 6G will give you basically maybe 100 gigabit per second, very high bandwidth, but potentially very high security. So security is obviously a key part of what we have to work on going forward. US actually does have some good security capabilities, but we don't have a plan, in my opinion, to effectively utilize them on a broad enough basis.
The main American objection to Huawei was, as President Trump said, we should call it spyware. It's alleged by the American government that if Huawei builds networks, it can steal data from them and learn Western secrets and compromise the privacy of Western citizens. One of our listeners asks whether new technology in terms of protecting data, say 6G, quantum telecommunications, whatever it might be, could such technology ease Western concerns about Chinese hacking or misuse of data?
Yeah, I think, the networks are susceptible to hacking. The reality, though, is your smartphone is much more susceptible to hacking than the infrastructure is. And of course, we have, 4 or 5 billion smartphones. But yeah, I think the newer technologies can give you significant protection. Probably nothing is 100%. Microsoft should be have a high security capability for what it does, but of course it doesn't. So I think the investments in security will involve quantum computing, quantum communications, but also AI-based algorithms. But again, nothing will be purely highly protected. But I think the the capabilities from a technology point of view should give you significant protection. The issue in terms of Huawei, in terms of the base stations, there is some validity to it, but actually you can actually violate the base station by having something close to an existing base station. And of course, when the communication from a base station to somewhere else can be fiber, but in many cases wireless. So even if you don't use the Huawei 5G infrastructure, you can still hack. But could you do it more effectively with a Huawei base station, or can they hack you? Yeah, they probably can. But so can Ericsson, so can Nokia, and so can anybody that actually has access to your data.
Another listener asks how you expect all this to end between the United States and China. There's been tit for tat, there have been negotiations. Will there ultimately be an agreement, or will we have a long-term Cold War over technology?
You know, that's a really, really interesting question. So what the problem we have with the US is we don't have a plan. We do things on the spur of the moment. Many of our senior officials don't have really good understanding of technology, of the global political issues, etc. On the other side, China is becoming more authoritarian, more control. And how long will the citizens put up with that? There's been some pushback because of 3D facial recognition, et cetera, et cetera. So we do have, in my opinion, right now, a situation where the conflict will get worse. And something has to happen to reduce the tension. But in my opinion right now, the Biden administration and also the consensus in Washington is that China is an enemy and it's very bad for the US. So we have to do some things that will slow them down, hurt them, etc. And then China is basically saying, okay, we will take certain hurt, but in my opinion, there'll be a pushback. And of course, you also have the global situation. You know, where will Europe go? I think Europe, in some ways, has come a little bit closer to the US, but Europe is very dependent on China from a market point of view. And earlier we showed also how dependent the US is from imports. If China tomorrow decides to reduce imports to the US of some key areas, we have big problems. So I think it's a balancing act. It's like the nuclear war kind of situation. But I think there can be some sparks that will make things significantly worse. So we expect the rest of the year to become more contentious, but hopefully there'll be some kind of rational thinking saying, look, it's better to work together. It's better to regard ourselves as competitors. And then for the US to look closely at where China is going and to have programs in those areas to be ahead of China. And AI is one of the key areas. Of course, that covers many, many, many things. But I think we need to energize the US to become a lot more aggressive in terms of technology development, business development. And the Washington activities right now in attacking Silicon Valley, yeah, they've overstepped, but you don't want to break them up. They've created jobs, they create technology, and they actually, the Apple phone is the best in the world. You can argue that maybe Samsung in some areas is better, Android is better, but what they've created in terms of jobs, employment, excitement is really positive. So the Washington Silicon Valley gap, to me, is a very negative thing for the US. In China, I think the increased control over data in terms of what's happened to Alibaba, Didi, that's a very negative thing for China.
Another listener asks, mentions that before you cited the fine, the $1.5 billion fine that ZTE paid to the United States, I think, for sanctions violations, and suggested that perhaps if Huawei paid a big fine, that might propitiate the United States. The listener asks, is there anything you would advise China to do to try to take the edge off American concerns about China as a prospective enemy?
Yeah, I think some of the areas that I think we basically recommend is the establishing of additional joint ventures, the building of a stronger, or basically reduce the tensions in the business environment area, expand the China market for the financial industry, open up the China market in terms of some of the data sharing. Yeah, I think there are a number of things the China can do to alleviate or reduce the tension. But if you look at Xi Jinping, his position, and the government leaders, right now, China will have GDP growth this year of about 6% or more. I think last year it was about 2% or 3% positive growth. China is doing very well. So the conflict with the US, 5G is a sore point. Smartphones, basically, that's not an issue. But from the Chinese leadership point of view, they've got the people highly motivated, highly competitive, looking down on the US. The propaganda is incredible. So right now they're on a growth path and they see the US maybe declining. So do they basically try and bridge the difference? Or do they increase the difference to continue to motivate the Chinese? So again, from their side, things are going well. Other than potentially the 5G build out.
A listener asks, based on your knowledge of so many of the companies involved in this arena, personally, would you rather invest in American big tech or in the Shanghai Stars board?
Okay, well, we're precluded from investing in any company because of our position. I don't know that. Sorry, I'm really, to be honest, I'm not smart enough to answer that. I know some of the companies on the Shanghai Stock Exchange that have actually had very good growth, but one of them actually has dropped by 50% in the last year. So again, that question, I'm sorry, I'm not smart enough to answer that one.
Okay, well, I had to ask it though.
Thank you.
Well, we're getting close to the hour, and we're very grateful to you. Let me give you the last minute or two to summarize how you see this and communicate whatever else you'd like to our listeners.
Yeah, I think back in 2010, we published a book called China America, and we compared the US to an old oak tree that was not given enough nutrition, not given enough water, and so on, and basically in some ways weakening. I think we see some of that again today. You know, we're very positive on US innovation. We're very positive on the ability of the US to be successful. But again, the policies we have are almost anti-business. And, you know, raise the taxes. Taxes on some companies are unfair and so on. But if you look at the employees of those companies, if you look at the employees of Amazon, for the taxes they pay, yeah, maybe there are some tax loopholes, but that's not the key issue. The key issue is we have to build employment. We have to strengthen our education system. We have to become more competitive in AI. So the US has the resources, the people resources, the ability to be successful. But in my opinion, we don't understand global competition. We missed it in terms of the Japanese automobile industry. I think in some ways we're missing it now in terms of China. So we need to learn more about China and then find ways to be competitive with them. In my opinion, having an open relationship with China where we're partners, but competitors as partners, that's what we have with Germany. That's what we have some other countries. That is the best long-term approach, but we don't see that happening. So if any of our listeners can actually influence Washington, provide any influence in China to get in that direction, I think that'll be very positive.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. And I do have to conclude with a word from our sponsor, Asia Times. We're grateful to all of you who subscribe to Asia Times. For those of you who don't, please consider subscribing. Like most publications, we depend on you, our subscribers, to support us and to be able to host events like this. So please subscribe early and often, get your friends to, and read Asia Times. With that, I'd like to thank all of you for participating and offer heartfelt thanks to Dr. Jones for a brilliant presentation and conclude this webinar. Good
Thank you
evening,
very
good
much.
afternoon, and good morning.
Thank you.